Okay, thanks for having me. Thanks to Mike and Steve and Don and everybody at San Diego for putting on such a great conference. This is rapidly becoming one of the highlights of the year for me every year. It's the most fun a guy can have wandering into a lion's den. And I also want to thank, in advance, give thanks to Michael McConnell for his comments on the paper. It's a real honor. It's also more than a little intimidating. When I heard that Michael McConnell would be offering comments on my paper on Originalism, it's kind of like hearing that Beethoven is going to be offering comments on your symphony. It's a little bit daunting, but still an honor. So let me briefly summarize the paper for you, and then I look forward to Michael's comments and then to our conversation that will follow. So the central point of the paper is, I think, pretty straightforward. The paper argues that the typical normative defenses of originalism don't work very well when you try to apply them to the 14th Amendment. So I just want to use my time here to briefly sketch out the bare bones of the argument. Most originalists, not all certainly, but most originalists defend their theory on some sort of normative grounds. And all of the most common and most influential normative defenses of originalism are all ultimately grounded on a fundamental premise that the Constitution was adopted by the collective will of a supermajority of the American people. So just to play out the standard normative defense of originalism, typically unfolds something like this. The Constitution was a sovereign act of the American people. It owes its status as law to the fact that the people collectively assented to it through the ratification process. And it owes its status as higher law, capable of trumping ordinary laws, to the fact that in enacting it, a supermajority of the American people chose, through an extraordinary, more deeply democratic process, to bind future ordinary representative majoritarian lawmaking within the confines of the Constitution. So since the Constitution owes its status as higher law to the fact that its precepts earned the collective assent of the American people, it necessarily follows, many originalists claim, that judges must give the Constitution the same meaning today that it had at the time of ratification. The Constitution meant something when it was ratified, and it was that something that the people agreed to be bound by. To give it another meaning today is to allow judges to enforce a legal rule that was never actually embraced and endorsed and enacted by the American people. And there's no warrant in a democratic nation for allowing judges to strike down popularly enacted laws unless those statutes violate the higher principles by which the people actually agreed to be bound. Or to get at the same point from a slightly different angle, the Constitution, as originally understood and collectively assented to by a supermajority of the people, is higher law. The only way to change the higher law is to follow the amendment procedures prescribed in that higher law. A supermajority of the people must collectively agree to alter the rules by which democracy is bound by following the constitutional amendment procedures in the Article 5 process. When judges give the Constitution a new meaning in the course of adjudication, they change the rules of higher law illegitimately, outside of the Article 5 process. And sovereignty, of course, rests with the people, not with a handful of unelected judges. So sometimes originalists will supplement this defense by analogizing the Constitution to a contract among the American people, and then say changing the meaning of the terms of the contract is effectively breaching the contract. Another more recent prominent normative defense of originalism comes from Mike Rappaport and John McGinnis, who've jointly offered this powerful new defense of originalism based on the idea that originalism is to be preferred on pragmatic grounds because it produces normatively better results for society. In a nutshell, I think their argument is that rules created by supermajoritarian process tend to produce the best results because they arose from a cooperative effort to serve the shared long-term interests of society as a whole, rather than ordinary statutes which tend to arise from an effort to serve the immediate and narrow interests of the majority party. And in order to receive the benefits of the rules enacted by supermajoritarian consensus, we have to interpret the Constitution according to its original meaning, because it was that meaning alone that earned the widespread support of the American people. So, as I think is pretty clear, all of these normative defenses of originalism are ultimately and explicitly grounded in the fact that the Constitution was enacted by some sort of supermajoritarian consensus. But the point of the paper is to say that the 14th Amendment was not enacted by supermajoritarian, bipartisan, national consensus. It was a purely partisan measure, drafted and enacted entirely by Republicans in a rump Reconstruction Congress in which the southern states were denied representation. It would have never made it through the Congress had an elected representatives from the South and elected senators from the South been permitted to vote. And it was ratified not by the collective assent of the American people, but rather at gunpoint. Southern states had been placed under military rule. They were forced to ratify the amendment, which they despised, as a condition of ending military occupation and rejoining the Union. So the paper spends a whole lot of time sort of trying to lay out the Southern response to the 14th Amendment. It's full of a lot of statements from politicians and Southern newspapers and the like. I won't lay out the history here, just to say there's a lot of colorful quotes full of indignant hyperbole, which makes for kind of a fun read. But the takeaway point is it would be very difficult to overstate the depth and breadth of opposition to the 14th Amendment in the South. Southern newspapers and leading politicians routinely described the amendment as using words like insulting, outrageous, abominable, obnoxious, nefarious, foul, monstrous. There was a remarkable consensus against the 14th Amendment among Southern politicians and the Southern, or the white Southern people more generally. And the consensus view in the South was that the Southern states would and could never, ever ratify it. As one Southern newspaper put it, the very idea is too disgusting and shocking to be entertained by the Southern mind. The shame of the deed, if done, would resound throughout the ages of the world. The governor of North Carolina flatly declared, no Southern state where the people are free to vote will adopt it. And the Joint Committee in the North Carolina legislature, to which the amendment had been referred, said, the South can never consent to it, never. And indeed, with the sole exception of Tennessee, the Southern legislatures all voted overwhelmingly to reject the 14th Amendment. The votes against the amendment were unanimous in just short of half of the Southern legislatures and almost unanimous in every single one of them. Those votes made clear that, as the governor of South Carolina explained to President Johnson, quote, worse terms may be imposed by Congress, but they will be imposed, not voluntarily accepted. The Southern people held firm to the views expressed by one newspaper editor, quote, never, never should the South adopt it. Never to literally, absolutely forced to do it. And that's what happened. The prevailing sentiment at this point in the Republican Congress was that, quoting Senator Doolittle, the people of the South have rejected the constitutional amendment, and therefore we will march upon them and force them to adopt it at the point of the bayonet, and establish military power over them until they do adopt it. And so Congress enacts the Military Reconstruction Acts, disbanding the Southern governments, placing the South under military rule, and providing that the only way to escape military rule is, among other things, to ratify the 14th Amendment. One Northern Democrat in Congress described the procedures outlined in the Reconstruction Act in the following terms, quote, you go to the people of these 10 states with the bayonet in one hand and your proposed constitutional amendment in the other, and ask them to make their choice, the amendment or the bayonet and the sword and military government. That is, you propose to coerce by military power of the people these states into ratification of your constitutional amendment. As President Johnson put it, quote, the military rule which the Reconstruction Act establishes plainly to be used solely as a means of coercing the people into the adoption of principles and measures to which it is known that they are opposed. And it worked. With no other choice, the Southern states eventually gave in and quite reluctantly ratified the 14th Amendment. So the bottom line is that the 14th Amendment never would have been ratified by the constitutionally required 3/4 of the states were it not for the use of force and coercion. And therefore the 14th Amendment can claim no warrant to democratic legitimacy through original popular sovereignty. It was added to the Constitution at gunpoint, despite its open failure to obtain the support of the necessary supermajority of the American people. And far from reflecting some sort of a bipartisan national consensus, the 14th Amendment was about as partisan as you can get. It was a purely partisan measure. As James Blaine, the House Republican from Maine, who went on to become the Speaker of the House, as he remembered it in his memoir afterwards, the 14th Amendment was, quote, carried from first to last as a party measure, unanimously supported by Republicans, unanimously opposed by Democrats. The line of Democratic hostility in the nation and in the state was absolutely unbroken. The amendment failed to attract the vote of a single Democratic member in any state legislature in the whole Union. So the unique concern with the 14th Amendment is that at the time of its adoption, a very sizable proportion of the American people, enough to defeat the Constitution's supermajority requirements, with a clear understanding, at least in general terms, of what the amendment was setting out to accomplish, they expressly and vehemently disagreed with it, and yet they were forced to ratify it against their will. Well, if originalism is justified because the provisions of the Constitution were voluntarily adopted by a supermajority of the American people in whom all sovereignty is vested, or because supermajoritarianism produces better laws, then what warrant is there for insisting on an originalist interpretation of an amendment that openly failed to obtain the support of a supermajority of the American people? And if originalism is justified because the Constitution is a contract among the American people, then what warrant is there for insisting on an originalist interpretation of a provision to which the people ultimately agreed to involuntarily under severe duress? So that's the challenge that the ratification of the 14th Amendment poses, I think, to normative defenses of originalism. And I'm interested in hearing why you think that challenge can be met.